What is our Dharma? What is our quest? If there's such a thing as a modern spiritual warrior, where that concept can be taken seriously, then inevitably what that spiritual warrior is going to have to do is focus. So last week I talked about the Bhagavad Gita and the larger story that surrounds it. That's the Mahabharata, right? It's an Indian epic that's 5 times as long as the Iliad and Odyssey combined. Both in that story and in a lot of other spiritual traditions, they'll end up talking about archers as a symbol for a spiritual aspirant. And when they talk about someone stringing their bow, they'll very often use that as a metaphor for sitting in stillness with good posture for meditation. Or if it's like a, yoga asana that is a seated asana, that's the same sort of thing, right? So focus in our day and age in particular is pretty difficult. It's actually like a skill you have to build, but it gets, in my opinion, increasingly more rare of a commodity or of a valuable substance as an asset that you can have in your life. It's not just a skill, although it certainly is that. So in a world where our digital connections are increasingly intrusive, invasive, where societal expectations and even expectations within relationships suddenly get amplified by the ease with which we're all connected, focus gets rarer and more precious. So in a life where if I don't answer a text quickly enough, or if I don't check every one of my, I don't even know how many notifications I get daily, and that's not necessarily me in particular, that's everyone, although also in my case, just because I'm an admin for a lot of things on Facebook, so literally all day I have to kind of mark notifications as read just all throughout my day. But if I don't stay on top of all that stuff, suddenly it's as if I'm doing an injustice to someone. But the permeability of my day, meaning like how many Swiss cheese holes, how many like open porous membranes there are in my day in terms of other people being able to claim parts of it, it's amplified so much by the access that they have to me through my technology. And even if they don't actually have that access, meaning like my phone might happen to be off, but the expectation doesn't go away. That's just the direction that our society has gone in. And that seems to get increasingly intense, not less intense. So if the whole society is shifting in that way, and everyone's day-to-day expectations also shift in that direction, it's very easy to get left behind. It's very easy to cause hurt feelings. It's very easy to project the appearance of like dropping the ball on someone if you are not lightning quick in responding to whatever demand they perceive that they have on your time, especially when they conflate technological access with deserved priority or like a legitimated need. And it's not that everyone out there has this inflated sense that's like perfectly kept pace with this increase in access. But I would argue that just from my own lived experience and also just keeping a tab on this philosophically over time, I would argue that the overall expectation of access and all the norms that have wrapped around that has definitely increased. It hasn't decreased. So here are a bunch of people who are walking around in the world trying to actually have a spiritual experience. And all of a sudden, they're challenged to do that. If it requires any sort of isolation, if it requires any sort of dedicated work, it is so much harder than it ever has been at any other time in history. Like on a day-to-day level, at the widest level possible for different people, I mean, it's not as if like crowded cities haven't been around for a long time, but even in a crowded city, um, you could kind of hole up in your own dwelling for the better part of a day if you wanted to. And it's not that you wouldn't have been able to hear things from outside. It's not that you wouldn't have been able to have visitors, but that, someone directly accessing you with a communication and some like expectation attached to that communication, it didn't happen at the same light speed. It didn't happen at the same level of permeability. Like it just wasn't the same. So even though as a species we've had crowded urban environments for a very long time now, as crowded as any urban environment we've ever had has been, it's still not the same. I mean, like, it was bad enough, and I'm obviously adding a value judgment there, but in terms of the bad parts of this problem, that's what I mean by that. It was bad enough when we invented phones, and suddenly someone from far away could interrupt whatever you were doing, and you wouldn't have even necessarily known who was making that interruption. But even that level of problem is not anywhere near the same as like you having a portable device on you at all times where you're getting notifications at light speed. If someone wants your attention, they can get it, and like immediately if you happen to be looking at that device for whatever useful reason you have that device. And the impact that this has on our ability to focus, it's hard to overstate. What else comes along with this massive uptick in perceived access and priority? If you have a professional life that extends anywhere beyond physical labor that you do in a specific time and a specific place, suddenly it's even harder to focus. So if you do any kind of work remotely, if you're any kind of digital nomad, if you are even some sort of knowledge worker that works for a consistent salary or hourly wage, but you happen to do so with remote tools, that is going to impact your day-to-day life and your ability to focus even more, because now your workplace lives with you and it never goes away. So your ability to focus on spiritual things outside of going to, let's say, like a yoga class that's dedicated to a specific hour where your phone has to be out, it's hard. Or if you could go to like a martial arts class and that be like your spiritual activity. And you obviously can't keep your phone in your hand the whole time you're doing that. But aside from that, it's hard. And we could come up with some other examples exactly like that. Like, let's say if you actually go to a church service or, like a temple service or like a Buddhist service, something like that. I mean, even in those circumstances, you can still have your phone on you. And I think some of those places might have rules about that. But for any of them that don't, I mean, you could just be sitting there looking at your phone the whole time, whether or not you meant to. And let's even talk about the scenarios where you don't. The scenarios like in my own, like if I go to that yoga class or if I go to that martial arts class, even the times that I'm literally not allowed to have that phone on me, the increased pressure and like the overall impact of expectations of being responsive 24 hours a day, if you are one of those kind of workers that I talked about earlier, where somehow your remote access is like one of the assets you rely upon to make your money. Anytime that you don't have it in your hand, like anytime that you do set aside time to actually do any of those activities, there's a higher likelihood than there ever has been in the past that it could actually be a problem that you were not able to see something come in to your communication device. And you might miss a notification or you might miss an important text from like a client or from a boss or something like that. And throughout my life and throughout my career, I've had many phases of my life where that actually was a pragmatic problem. I mean, the environment that I worked in was like fast-paced, high-pressure production kind of environments. It was actually a problem if it took longer than an hour for me to see a text. If it was a certain kind of text, if it was like during some hazily defined quote-unquote normal window of time, meaning like sometime in the morning until sometime at night, that workplace had some kind of claim on my time, which was enforced through the mobile technology. So even times where I was supposed to, quote unquote, put my phone away to be completely present in whatever activity I was in, there was still that looming liability of what if that's the time when that important communication comes in. And, at the time, the response could have been like, oh, well, I was in class and I couldn't see that. And 90% of the time that might have had to have been okay, like quote unquote okay. But the reality was it still could have been a real problem if I hadn't gotten that notification at the time that I needed to get it for a lot of the jobs that I had. And by no means am I the only person who lived under those kind of conditions. I mean, it's tough out there in the economic marketplace, and most of the people I know have some kind of side hustle. A lot of the people I know are remote knowledge workers, particularly during the pandemic. If they hadn't been remote before, suddenly they found that they were remote. And the expectations that came along with that for all these people suddenly increased. And even for those of us who are able to carve out time with some level of consistency to go to those activities that had spiritual dimensions that did require us to put our phone away, there would still be kind of a tax we would pay for that in a way, like a little bit of background looming anxiety, a little bit of aggregate stress that would carry over. And occasionally we would miss one of those important communications, and then it would just be something we'd have to deal with, right? Whether or not there was any kind of recognition that, we're allowed to be a human being and have time to ourselves, there would still be some thing that would have to be dealt with, like some problem that would have to be dealt with, where it would have to be acknowledged that for whatever reason we were not tied to our phone at all times. So I've spent a considerable amount of time talking about this particular aspect of focus, meaning the problem that people have with focus in this day and age, when it's probably one of the most foundational requirements to be a very spiritual aspirant or seeker with any level of intensity. It requires focus. So that also engenders a big level of sacrifice. And a lot of the sacrifice that it might include is opportunity, in my opinion, right? So there are certain things that you're not going to be able to do in a competitive marketplace if you dedicate significant periods of your life or even your day-to-day time to severing that harsh expectation of access 24/7, from isolating yourself from it, right? In a competitive marketplace, you are giving ground to your competition when you excuse yourself in that way. And yet, there's another argument that you could be very competitive in a different way, nonetheless, if you did that. And there's also another argument that if you don't do that, then you might get burnt out anyway. And you might just be one of these people in the marketplace who burn out prematurely because they had to be wired 24/7 in a state of access that we weren't, arguably just not designed to do as a species. I don't think we were designed to be on 24/7 like that. I don't think our neurology is really built for that or designed for that. I think all the studies I've ever read, it's just disastrous, right? It's not to say that a caveman with an extraordinarily short life expectancy had an easy life either, right? They were constantly stressed out for very different reasons. But they also weren't designed for this 24-hour-a-day kind of availability where they would be tethered by their mobile device to constantly communicate with people that they couldn't even see up front in front of their face at all times in this highly concentrated kind of way. So focus is extraordinarily difficult to do under those circumstances, and yet it's a requirement. If anyone is ever serious about spiritual aspiration. And in this case, we can even just define that as consciousness expansion, the expansion of your capabilities as a person, growth. It requires focus, and focus is so scarce and it's so hard to carve out. And to add yet another dimension onto that, we talk about a crowded marketplace with challenges and how competitive it is. I mentioned most of the people I know have at least some kind of side gig. I would take it a step further and say most of the people I know don't just have a side gig right now, but they are stacking side gigs. And what's another casualty of that, even above and beyond the availability problem of remote technology? The other problem is the inability to do quote unquote deep work. And there's a good book out there by the name Deep Work, which explains exactly what I'm talking about. But if we're in a marketplace that requires us to have about 1 million side gigs, or even like one main gig plus a stack of other smaller side gigs, what it very often means is there's suddenly a scarcity of tasks or projects that we're able to devote ourselves deeply to. Meaning like we have to do a few minutes here, a few minutes there, a few minutes here, a few minutes there. We are forced to multitask in a lot of circumstances. But multitasking is another one of those things that study after study shows we are not good at it, generally speaking. Some people can develop some very specific skills to get better at multitasking, but in terms of our neurology at a baseline level, it's one of those aptitudes that we think we're a lot better at than we are, when in reality, it's something we're actually pretty bad at. Like when you multitask, you're generally more apt to do both of those things much worse than you are if you were to focus on either of them alone. And yet, the shape of this marketplace I don't want to say forces, that's a strong word, but it so strongly pressures so many of its actors to have to multitask, to have like multiple streams of income, to serve clients at the same time that they serve bosses, hopefully not in the same actual contracted time, because there's an ethical problem with that. That's like time stealing. But honestly, I know a lot of people who do, and a lot more people than I used to. The same sorts of people that would say, no, I would never do that. That's unethical. A huge chunk of those people I know in this day and age are like, oh yeah, no, if I get an urgent enough client thing during my salaried workday, I take care of it. End of story. So the number of people I know who are willing to say that sort of thing out loud has like in my own anecdotal experience, drastically increased. So now all of a sudden, at a societal level, we have a hard time focusing because the technological expectations have increased around us. We have a harder time focusing because the marketplace pressures have forced us, or at least strongly influenced us, to deprioritize deep work, like work that requires hours and hours of concentration, in favor of fragmented periods of our day where we spend a little time on this, we spend a little time on that, we spend a little time on this, we spend a little time on that. And all of a sudden, what ends up happening is we're getting further and further away from a circumstance where we are able to do serious, dedicated, exceptional work to expand ourselves. We're suddenly far less able to do the serious work it takes to be a quote-unquote spiritual warrior, if there's such a thing as being a spiritual warrior in this day and age, right? And this is why people end up taking retreats where they say, hey, I'm putting my phone away for a week or whatever. This is why people end up, let me actually rewind it to a wider scope here. This even in the crowded urban cityscape era, right? This is why people would end up becoming monks or join monastic orders outside of the usual fold of society, because they're like, hey, when we're in the daily in and out economy of living in this urban backdrop, it's literally impossible for us to focus in a serious way. So that's why there was this intense need to say, let's go in the forest. Let's cut all of it out. Let's go join a monastery. Let's cut all of it out. Let's do whatever we can to actually go into an environment where we can focus, even if it means we have to sacrifice a lot of other things. But here, that central historical problem of Hinduism rears its head again. What about everybody else who still wants to have a spiritual experience? What about all the householders? What about all the people who are still enmeshed in these urban environments with a high frequency of economic exchange and all the expectations that come with that? What about all the people who still have 100 stale transactions a day they have to go through and yet still want some sort of experience of expanding themselves and getting in touch with something deeper? And that's all just my way of framing a challenge, right? I don't really necessarily have my own answer to this. It's something I'm still working on a lot. I've tried different things to be able to focus, but ultimately one of my own personal answers at different times has just been to take it on the chin. Um, and what do I mean by that? I've talked about earlier periods in my life where I had much more important expectations of access, like more responsibilities for a remote job, where, I had very needy clients, very needy bosses, high pressure media production and all that kind of stuff. And I walked away from those kind of jobs eventually, and even the higher degree of financial reward. And I did it out of necessity. Like I couldn't keep up with it anymore. It destroyed my relationships. It destroyed my mental health. It was just bad. So I regained some ability to focus directly at the same time that I sacrificed some of my own economic potential. I would put it that way, right? As soon as I took a lower paying job with lower expectations, and I could meaningfully say I clock in at 8:30 and I leave at 5. I was almost immediately in my own personal life rewarded with better results in terms of my ability to be a quote unquote spiritual warrior. And in pragmatic terms, just a few examples. Suddenly I was able to focus again on my martial arts pursuits. I wasn't like missing several days at a time of class. I wasn't missing weeks at a time even of class. I was able to say, no, I clocked out at 5. I left work behind me. And suddenly I could go to class. And when that happened, all of a sudden I went from being like a 5-year blue belt in BJJ to suddenly like tearing through all the different ranked belts, whether or not that means anything. And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But all of a sudden I was able to make progress in my roles where people who I could never have dreamed of really like giving a hard time before, when I was still shaped like my office desk, or even the one that I had at home. Suddenly when I wasn't shackled by that same thing every day, I was able to make progress and start giving everybody else in the room a hard time. And then eventually all the way to the top of my own particular pool, where I was like, I can give literally everyone in this room a hard time. In terms of my training partners and opponents that they would put in front of me and all that kind of stuff. So sometimes the ability to carve out focus requires that kind of sacrifice. And maybe that doesn't mean going out to the woods. Maybe that doesn't mean joining a monastic order. Maybe that means taking a hard look at some of the responsibilities that you've already accepted and saying, like, what am I actually getting out of this? What of this is persistent value, and what of this isn't worth it to me? So in my own case, that is a decision that I made. I was like, okay, this isn't worth it to me. And I stepped down from the higher paying job, and this was a long time ago, but I immediately got increased ability to focus, especially once my own nervous system got some time to recover from all that high stress, that like permanent environment of high stress. And once all those things happened, and in one very measurable area of quote unquote spiritual pursuit for me, I had immediate improvement. It wasn't even a question. It was like night and day immediate improvement. Suddenly, and further on down the road, when I made another similar decision, suddenly I was able to do other things more, like do yoga. And now I'm in kind of a similar situation, but from a very different angle, where I'm trying as much as I can to do my own businesses and side hustles and stuff. And the stack of side hustles that I'm assembling is in its end result starting to kind of approach a similar level in some ways to the high stress work environment that I had before. So even now, as I'm doing a very different kind of day-to-day experiment and I have economic pressures mounting, I have to make similar kinds of questions to myself, like how am I going to find the ability to focus? How am I going to find the ability to do deep work? And that also requires recognizing that it is an ability and recognizing that it in some ways it can be a luxury, right? But also recognizing that other paradox, which is if I don't do it, it's going, like if I don't take time off, the time off will take me, right? Time off in this case, even just being like the ability to do focused work, the ability to do something in a focused manner, the ability to carve out deep work in my day, rather than just doing a stack of 10 things for 10 different masters, right? So that's a paradox most of us have, not just in terms of spiritual growth, but in terms of like long-term economic survival, right? But it is definitely also a paradox a lot of us have for our own spiritual growth. Like, and it's a question that we have to pose ourselves. How are we going to fight for our own ability to focus? How are we going to recognize that it is a luxury? It is, it's a privilege, but it's one that we have to fight for. Where can I carve out this ability for me to focus? Where can I carve out this time for me to do deep work? Because when we go back to that image of the archer as the spiritual aspirant, the archer is the one who practices shooting his arrows at the bullseye all day. And if not all day, then like for a significant part of the day. And when the story that illustrates one of the reasons why they pick the image of the archer as the devotee or the spiritual aspirant or the student is another one from the Mahabharata, which serves real nicely to illustrate this. So there's the Pandava brothers and a handful of their cousins, and they're at archery practice as young children under their martial arts guru, and they're all lined up to shoot arrows at a stuffed bird. So the martial arts guru lines, let's say 5 of the Kaurava brothers up and 5 of the Pandavas, because there's only 5 Pandavas. And he asks them about what they see. He has them knock their arrow, he has them pull the string, take aim, and he asks them what they see. And each of the different children with the bow and arrow describe different things about what's in front of them. Like, oh, I see the sky. I see the sun hiding behind the clouds. And, I see the feathers of the stuffed bird. That's their target, right? And they each say different things like this. Like, they each have their own unique answers about the landscape that's in front of them and everything that's surrounding the target. And like different aspects of the target, what the feathers look like on the stuffed bird and all that sort of thing. They each have different and unique answers. And one by one, he tells them to put their bow down and he tells them not to shoot an arrow, all the way until he gets to Arjuna, who's, one of the main characters in the Mahabharata. He's the one who and in the Bhagavad Gita, he gets the big speech by Krishna, right? He's the one who gets that spiritual dissertation about the varieties of yoga and, so on and so forth. But by the time Drona, the martial arts guru, gets to Arjuna, he asks him to explain what he sees. And Arjuna says, I can't. And his martial arts guru says, why? And Arjuna says, because I can only see the eye of the bird, meaning like he couldn't see anything else but the absolute bullseye of the target. He literally could not see anything else. Everything else was excluded from his vision. He only allowed himself to see the eye of the bird. And so Drona, the martial arts guru, at that very moment said, fire, like shoot your arrow. And of course, Arjuna shoots his arrow and it goes right through the eye of the bird, bullseye. So the lesson there is, like the implied lesson, is for you to actually hit your bullseye and to focus. It kind of involves cutting all of the other stuff out. And that's a harsh, seemingly limiting thing to do. But it's also the only way to hit the bullseye. So the only way to hit the bullseye is focus, and the only way to focus sometimes is to cut out all the distracting stuff. So just to bring this full circle, like on a pragmatic day-to-day level for all of us, For a lot of us, that's going to mean making a very different relationship with your phone and your expectations, and like how much access you give this technology to your own nervous system, and like how much you let those notifications dominate your life. And yes, I get that some people are in a hustle and some people are in a business and some people are in competitive marketplaces where that immediate access is a requirement, but you better know what you're buying. So anyone who wants to be a serious spiritual seeker, serious warrior, serious spiritual warrior, which is a cross-section of those two things, or even anyone who wants the ability to focus and expand themselves, you're going to have to take a hard look at whatever takes your focus away. And, the main reason why I picked on technology so much in this discussion is that's the biggest one, in my opinion, for most people. That's the one they usually have to start with because it's the one that's most up in everybody's faces. And most of us have done it voluntarily, right? Even though that the voluntary status of that can be called into question, like, well, is it really that voluntary if it's suddenly an expectation? Like if all of a sudden I can't even get a job if I'm not like glued to my phone all day, right? Like if I can't get callbacks or if I can't get clients to hire me or if I can't respond to leads or whatever. And I get that. But nonetheless, whatever aspect of this is voluntary, that's what you got to take a hard look at, in my opinion. So hopefully this discussion of focus, particularly in our digitally modern context, has been of value, but I encourage everyone to just ponder that for a little while. What will focus require of you, and what are you going to end up omitting from your vision that's everything other than the eye of the bullseye, and what will that look like for you?